Let's be honest, for a lot of us teachers, lesson planning can feel like a total chore, right? Just another bit of paperwork to get through. But what if we completely reframe that? What if we started seeing it not as admin, but as the very heart of our professional thinking, as a core skill that can totally transform our teaching? Okay, let's get into it.
It's a fair question, isn't it? I mean, classrooms are these wonderfully chaotic, dynamic places. Researchers talk about them having multidimensionality, so lots of things are happening at once. Then there's simultaneality. They're all happening at the exact same time. And of course, a huge amount of unpredictability. So with all that going on, why would you even bother with a plan that could just get thrown out the window in 5 seconds?
Now this is what I find fascinating. Look at how planning changes as you get more experience. When you're a novice teacher, you might spend hours scripting out every single word, every single move. But expert teachers, they might just have a few quick notes on a piece of paper. Don't let that fool you though. The thinking that happens before the lesson is so much richer. They're thinking about the big picture and the small details all at once. It's a real shift from trying to script a performance to actually designing an experience for your learners.
And now brings us to our first big challenge, finding that sweet spot, that perfect balance between structure and spontaneity. How do you walk into a classroom with a solid plan without accidentally squashing the magic of those unscripted, spontaneous moments?
This quote from a veteran teacher just nails it. It really captures the big danger of a super rigid plan. When you've poured hours into making this perfect script, the thought of just abandoning it can be genuinely terrifying, even if your students are pulling the lesson in a much more exciting and relevant direction.
So, here's the crucial takeaway. Sometimes the absolute best, most memorable learning happens in those moments you didn't plan for. It's in the cracks of the lesson, the little gaps where learners suddenly take the lead, use language in a really creative way, and make these genuine connections. Sometimes, abandoning your plan is the best thing you can do to support real learning.
So, how do we get that balance? Well, here's a really powerful metaphor for you. Think of your lesson plan not as a cage that traps you, but as a climbing frame. A good climbing frame has a solid, reliable structure you can count on. But within that structure, kids can move freely, they can explore, they can make their own choices. Your plan should do the same thing, offer support without being restrictive.
Okay, let's move on to our next big idea, which builds on this perfectly. Let's start thinking of our planning as an act of design, not just filling in a prescription. You're not just a technician filling out a form, you're more like an architect, creatively designing a space for learning.
And design thinking gives us a really useful framework for this. First, you frame the problem. You get a really clear picture of your specific class and their context. Then, you empathize. This is key. You put yourself in your student's shoes and ask, how are they going to experience this? And finally, you visualize it. You play the movie of the lesson in your head, imagining the flow, the energy, and how people are going to interact.
Just like movies have genres and stories have narrative arcs, lessons often follow recognizable patterns. We can think of these as lesson shapes, these recurring sequences that give a lesson its rhythm and its internal logic.
You probably recognize some of these shapes already. You've got the classic Presentation Practice Production Model, or PPP, super structured, very teacher-led. It's great for introducing a specific new grammar point, for example. Then you have something like task-based learning, which is much more learner-centered. It throws students right into a real-world task to get them talking first. And then there's Test, Teach, Test, which is really responsive. You first check to see what students already know, and then you only teach the bits they're struggling with. The key here isn't about which one is best, it's about knowing you have these different design patterns in your toolkit to choose from.
Of course, any good design has to have a purpose. And that brings us to aims and outcomes. What exactly do we want our learners to be able to do by the time they walk out of our classroom?
Now, there's a really important distinction to make here. You can have a knowledge aim, like learners will know the rule for the present perfect. Or you can have an ability aim, learners will be able to tell a story about a past experience. See the difference? One is about knowing something abstract. The other is about being able to do something practical with the language. And for language teachers, focusing on ability is what really empowers our students.
A fantastic way to make sure your lesson actually hits its target is to use backward design. It might sound a bit strange, but instead of starting with the fun activity, you start at the very end. First, you define exactly what you want your students to be able to do. Second, you figure out how you'll know they can do it. What's the final task?
And only then, as a third step, do you plan all the activities that will get them to that point. It makes sure everything you do in the lesson has a real purpose.
But of course, a plan is just a piece of paper without the most important ingredient of all, the people. So let's talk about planning for the actual real-life human beings in your classroom.
A truly great plan always starts with a deep understanding of who's in the room. You have to consider their age, their proficiency level, their first languages and cultural backgrounds, what motivates them, and what their specific needs are. Putting together a kind of class profile is an absolutely foundational first step.
But, and this is a huge but, we have to be so careful here. A class profile is a guide. It is not a set of rigid labels. The second we start putting people in boxes and stereotyping them, we are limiting their potential. The whole point is to plan for unique, complex individuals, not for some fixed, static profile. We also have to remember that learning doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The most powerful lesson plans are the ones that break down those classroom walls. They connect what's happening in the lesson to how language is actually used out there in the real world. They value and integrate a student's own life experiences, and they use authentic stuff, materials and tasks from the student's own communities.
So, when you put all of these pieces together, what does it all add up to?
Well, it paints a picture of the teacher not as some kind of technician just following a manual, but as an informed, creative, and adaptive professional.
And here's the real secret, I think. The ultimate value of lesson planning isn't the document you end up with. It's the process itself. It's the act of thinking deeply about your students, of anticipating the challenges, of mentally rehearsing the journey you're about to take together. The plan is just a record of that thinking. The thinking is where the real magic happens.
This really brings us to the core cycle of our profession. An effective lesson starts with thoughtful design. Then, in the classroom, it's brought to life with responsiveness, reacting to your learners in the moment. And afterwards, it gets even better through honest reflection. Design, enact, reflect. That right there is the art of great teaching.
So let's just end with this thought. Your lesson plan, it's your map. It's essential for getting the journey started. But the real adventure, the real discovery begins when your learners, your fellow explorers, find a new path that you never even saw on the map. And the real question is, are you ready to follow them?